Welcome to the All Out Leadership Podcast, hosted by Pastor Eric Lawson, where each episode is uniquely designed to help you live all out by bringing you practical leadership from a biblical perspective delivered in 10 minutes or less. So whether you're a business leader, serving in ministry, or simply looking to grow in your leadership, this podcast is for you. Before we dive into this week's topic, make sure to subscribe to the podcast and download the show notes at ericlawson.com/podcast. And while you're at it, feel free to share the content on social media. Now, let's join Pastor Eric for this week's conversation.
Welcome to another edition of the All Out Leadership Podcast. We've been looking at David and the opportunity that he had to cut some corners, literally with Saul, his leader. He had cut the corner of his robe. His conscience had bothered him. And I find the mark of a great leader is they have a conscience. And when they make mistakes, and they will make mistakes, we all make mistakes, but does it ever bother you? Does it catch up with you? And that's what I see about David. He had a tender conscience, and he dealt with his mistake. And so he had this opportunity, and he cut the corner of Saul's robe, which we looked at last week, how that's really undermining your leader. Now, why does God allow these imperfect leaders inside of our life? I want to make a statement. Imperfect leaders perfect us. God allows imperfect leaders to perfect us. Now, when I think of a perfect leader, I think of Jesus. When I think of imperfect leaders that led Jesus, it was his parents. His parents went to Jerusalem. Jesus was 12 years of age. They got caught up in the hustle and bustle. They started traveling back, and the Bible says that after a day, they realized Jesus was not in their company. And then it took another few days to find Jesus. So 3 to 4 days had passed until they found Jesus. Look, that's called bad parenting. When you forget Jesus, like you got an assignment, God the Father says, hey, I'm going to trust you with my son. Could you take care of him? And you lose him. Now, before we get judgmental towards Mary and Joseph, we've all misplaced Jesus. How many times have we gone more than 3 days and realized Jesus wasn't in our midst because we just were too busy for God? So let's not get too harsh on them. But when they came back to Jerusalem, they find Jesus in the temple, dialoguing with the Pharisees. Listen to this statement that his mother goes, why did you do this to us? And I find that interesting. She blamed Jesus. How many things are we blaming other people for that is actually our fault? Because it is much more enjoyable to blame others than take ownership. In Luke chapter 2, verse 50, but they did not understand the statement which he spoke to them, that I must be about my Father's business. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject to them. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and favor with God and men. Jesus knew more about the subject, but he was still subject to them. Even though Jesus understood more than his parents, he's 12 years old, and he's the only teenager that actually was smarter than his parents. Now, every teenager thinks they are, but in human history, Jesus is the only teenager who actually was smarter and knew more than his parents. And you know what he did? He honored them. He respected the office that they stood in as his spiritual covering as mom and dad, and he went back. And he was subject to them, even though he knew much more about the subjects. And the result of him being able to submit to imperfect leaders was what? He grew. He increased in wisdom, stature, and in favor. When God allows imperfect leaders in your life and you know how to manage your heart, you know how to walk in forgiveness, you know how to do certain things, and we'll give you some tips here in a minute, here's what's happened. Ultimately, you're going to grow, God's going to use it, and you're going to continue to grow in favor and in wisdom. There are some things you can only really learn actually under a difficult, imperfect leader. In fact, imperfect leaders teach us some things that actually help us become better leaders. When I started out in ministry, I had one of my first ministry positions, and it was just a very frustrating leader that I worked for. They were godly, loved Jesus, prayed a lot, and it was just frustrating. So I actually was 24 years old, and I got out a folder, and I entitled it this. And I titled this folder, What I Won't Do When I Pastor. I knew God had called me someday to pastor a church, and I just go, you know what? I'm learning a lot of things about what I don't want to do. I'm going to go ahead and fill up this folder. And what was crazy is my folder of what I want to do and my folder of what I won't do, actually, that folder was larger. I learned more of what not to do than what to do under certain leaders in my journey. But ultimately, God used all that to create part of the culture and the unique vision of who we are at Element Church. Element Church is not a perfect church, but God has given us a great culture. We have some unique things in how we do things. And all that really stemmed out of some of my pain and some of my challenges of working underneath difficult people. I remember saying one time to a friend, I said, I'm going through this right now so my staff won't ever have to. There were ways that I was treated. There were ways in my journey that I was neglected. There were ways that I was mismanaged. And I just made notes to go, you know what? I know how that feels now. I'm going to make sure others don't feel that. And I wrote those things down to be a reminder so that I wouldn't repeat those same things. Look, it's hard to identify with how our decisions make people feel, how it puts burdens on them unnecessarily, unless we've walked through some of that. So one of the things I walked away with is salary compensation reviews. I was part of an organization one time where there was zero process to ever review a salary. And I was in the organization where I continually got more and more responsibility, more responsibility, more responsibility. And over 3 years, my pay didn't change. It was $28,000. And I was doing twice, 3, 4 times of when I was hired. Now, there weren't systems in place that would help there be consistent salary reviews. So as a leader, I said, you know what? I want to make sure that our staff are fairly compensated. What are reasonable price ranges? What are competitive market ranges? What is the system for continual salary reviews? There was also times that no matter what you did, no matter how many extra miles you went, you never seemed to be financially compensated for it. And look, we love Jesus and we're in ministry for God, but at the same time, we have family, we got kids, we got bills. And at the end of the day, truth is, we all need a paycheck. And so I said, you know what? I think that there are times that there should be performance bonuses. There should be ways where our staff can go, hey, I worked extra hard and here's incentives. And so I learned from my painful experiences where the only time I ever got a raise was when I had to ask for it. And I go, that's not a healthy culture in terms of salary compensation. Now, there were a lot of great things in the organization that I learned from, but I learned from this painful thing of how can I, when I'm a boss, I'm a leader, help my staff not go through that. One of the other things that I encountered was I worked way too much. I was in a culture where I was working 7 days a week and nobody was asking me, how are you doing? How much are you working? Are you taking time for yourself? How's your walk with Jesus? How's it at home? I was just work, 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 work. And the only thing that was ever celebrated was work, 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 work. And I go, that's not a healthy culture. So I go, I'm going to learn from that. So I remember one of the first times I actually threatened to fire somebody at Element Church that was on staff was because they would work on their day off. And this person continually worked. And I said, look, I love you so much that I'm going to let you go if you keep working on your day off. I want you to go home, love your wife, be a dad, and you go home and take care of your family. Because if everything's going well at home, everything will be well here at your job. Take your days off and know how not to be a workaholic. And so I learned that from my own painful experience. There wasn't somebody watching over me, taking care of me. And honestly, there were times I was abused. I remember being 20, 21 years old, working on a staff, and I was literally working 70 hours a week. I was in Bible school. I was volunteering in the youth ministry on Wednesdays. I was volunteering on Sunday youth ministry. I was volunteering on the bus ministry on Saturday, and I was working 70 hours a week for salary, and my pay, actually, I figured it out one time. It came to $2.43 an hour. And I go, that ain't fair, and I learned from that one too. Great place, great church, great organization. There were just some oversights, and there were just a few blind spots, all right? Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There were many great things about that church that were better than the few things I was going through, but I learned from it, and here's the deal. My pain is your gain. I tell my staff, my pain is your gain. I went through pain, so it's your gain today. God allowed Saul over David because it ultimately made David a greater king because of the failures of the person above him. Now, cover your leader's weakness. Cover your leader's weakness. Genesis chapter 9, verse 22, it's the story of Noah. After the flood, he built a vineyard and he just got a little too excited about the harvest, and he got drunk, and the Bible says that he was naked inside of his tent, because that's what drunkenness does. It causes you to make a lot of dumb decisions that you always wake up regretting, and that's what happened with Noah. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his fathers, and he told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on their shoulders, and went backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. They did not go out as Ham did and go out and talk about his father's flaws. Ham was a ham because he exposed his father's nakedness. It's a privilege to get close enough to your leader to see your leader's flaws. And every leader looks great from a distance, but when you get up close, that knight in shining armor just turns out to be Shrek and some armor, all right? The closer you get to your leader, you're going to realize they're just a human, they're just a broken vessel that Jesus uses, okay? So it's a privilege to get close enough to your leader to see their flaws. Are you mature enough to manage that inside of your own heart? Or do you go out and to undermine your leader and talk about your leader's flaws? Look, when you get bent out of shape because your leader has flaws and shortcomings and inadequacies, it tells me you put too much hope in your leader and not enough hope in Jesus. Jesus is the only leader without flaws and the only leader that won't disappoint you. So, can you manage that inside of your heart? Now, something I have observed over the years from different staff, not all staff, but some, as they got closer to me, I'd find they'd get a critical spirit towards me because of this. They would measure their strength against my weakness. They had a specific strength that was stronger than me in an area, and they judged their strength against my weakness. And so they would get critical of me. And I go, hey, here's the deal. The reason I hired you was because you're better at that than me. I knew I had a weakness and I needed your strength. That's why I hired you. Here's what I would always also challenge them. I go, why don't you go ahead and try this? Why don't you measure your weakness against my strength? That's not human nature. We just want to judge others' weaknesses against our strengths. But know this, wherever your leader is weak, they are strong somewhere you're not. Now, a smart leader hires for their weaknesses. So if you are in a room and you're with your leader and you see this continual weakness in your leader, maybe they're not a great organizer. You know what? Maybe they're a little too direct. Maybe they have a little bit lower emotional intelligence. Maybe they aren't great people persons. Here's the deal. Chances are, if you're the people person and they're not, they knew that. That's why they hired you, because they hired you for their weakness. Don't judge your leader's weakness against your strength. Don't forget, they have a strength that's greater than your weakness. And so we need one another. So just a few practical tips on how you can navigate inside of your heart when God allows difficult leaders over you. Next week, we're going to look at confrontation. Do you confront? Do you not confront? If you do, what do you say? How do you say it when you have difficult leaders above you? See you next week.
Thank you for joining us on the All Out Leadership Podcast. We hope you gained new biblical insight that challenged you to grow in your leadership. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, we would love your help in getting the content out farther. You can help by subscribing to the podcast at ericlawson.com/podcast and telling others about it. Next week, Pastor Eric will be back with another episode. So until then, we hope you have a great week being an all-out leader.